HX Stomp and the Helix platforms are awesome. Everything's all in one. But sometimes you just have that favorite Eddie Van Halen phaser pedal that you want to use in your rig. But how do you put it in and how do you connect it? I'm Twisty, and in this video I'm going to take you through how to use the effects loop on the HX Stomp to get the best outcome with your external pedals. Let's have a look. For pedals that work best in front of the signal path, so compressor, overdrive, distortion, etc., then placing them in front, so between the bass and the Helix, or the HX Stomp, works the best. Just treat them like another pedal on the pedal board and daisy chain it through. Bass, compressor, distortion, HX. But what about for modulation effects like the phaser or a chorus or some delay? Those things work best after the tone controls or the amp rather than before it. Normally, you put them in an effects loop on your amp. So let's do the same thing with the HX. The HX is now my amp, and I'm going to use the effects loop on the back of that to engage this modulation pedal. So in this previous video up here somewhere, I talked about using the effects send and return when we're using the 4-cable method to connect your HX to your external amp. But in this case, I don't want to use the external amp. I want to use the amp models within the Helix, but I want to use that external pedal to connect into that effects loop. Now, to do that, I'm going to need a couple of things. Obviously, I'm going to need my effects pedal or effects pedals. And I'm going to need a couple of cables. So one for the send and one for the return. Alternatively, I'll still need one for the return, but because the HX Stomp has a stereo send and return, I can use this stereo to mono lead. So this will go out left and right, and then that allows me to have effectively 2 send loops, a left and a right loop. We'll go into that when we have a look at how to configure your HX. So connectivity is very simple. I'm using the stereo cable because my other one's a little bit small, and also I'd prefer to do that because it gives me the options of having a second loop if I want to have that. So I have the send going as input to the phaser. I then have the output of the phaser going into the return on the left hand side of the HX. So I've got the left send, left return, and it becomes that effects loop, or in the other case, the send and return loop. On the global settings, on the send and return loop for the left, I've got that set for line, and that's because I'm going to an effects pedal. If I was using the return as an instrument input, then I would set that to instrument, but at the moment I'm using it for effects, so I've got it set to line. I do the same thing if I'm sending to my bass amp, because I use the effects return on the amp to get it. Now, if I'm going to the input or the in on your amp rather than the effects loop, then I would set that to instrument. I'm doing the same thing with the right loop. I've got that set to line. And then you've got the return type. So remember, the return type could either be a return or auxiliary in. The main difference is the auxiliary in means any sound coming in is no longer part of my signal chain, but I can still hear it. Whereas with the return, anything coming in is now subject to the effects on my signal path. That's it, pretty simple. So let's have a look at the HX edit, and so you can visualize what I'm going to be doing. So what I've created is just a default bass signal flow. I've got a compressor. I'm going through to an Ampeg SV4 Pro, and I've just got a 4x10 cabinet on there. I've done almost nothing on there, and without the effects in the loop. Fairly neutral. So the first thing we're going to look at is the effects loop. So an effects loop allows you to send to an external device and then return to the same spot from that external device. So in this case, I'm going out of the Helix at this point. So I'm going bass guitar into the compressor. From the compressor, I'm going into the effects loop. The effects loop, I'm sending out to my phaser, and then I'm coming back from the phaser, going into the front of the amp model, and then the amp's sending to the cab, and then I'm going out to the, in this case, the door or the front of house or your amp or cab or whatever it is you're connecting yourself to. If I look at the effects loop itself, it's got a couple of different things on it. So I've got a send volume, so that can determine the amount of sound I'm sending from the bass to the effects loop. I've got a return. Now I've turned this all the way up to 6 so that I can demonstrate clearly that the phaser is working. But again, this is, you would adjust this on the volume coming back from the pedal. Now, in the case of the phaser, there's no gain control, but if you've got a pedal which has a gain on it, you may want to drop the volume of the return back so that it's in line with the volume of your rest of your signal path. Now, mix is allowing me to send the dry signal and some of the wet signal through. So it's currently set at a 50% mix. So that's going to sound like this. If I drop that to about 30%, which is about where I would normally put a phaser if I was putting the phaser on in the digital box. So I'd have it about 30%. Now again, I've got the volume, I've got the controls on the phaser turned up fairly loudly. Again, I'm using this to demonstrate the sound rather than the tone that it's getting. So again, I can play with that. Or I can have it 100%, which means that I'm getting no dry signal whatsoever. So that's all phaser. There's no dry signal coming through that at all. And trails allows you to then effectively, so I'll play it without the trail. Trail's on. You can hear it echoes or holds out until it decays itself. I pretend to have the trails turned off, but again, it depends on the effects you want and the outcome you're looking for. For me, having the trails off means that when I finish playing the note, the effect turns off, as opposed to it clashing if I have something else going on at the same time. So that's the effects loop. So again, the effects loop allows me to send out and come back to the same position that I sent from. Now the main difference then between the send and return in this case is I'm same preset, same everything else, but this time I'm sending before I get to the amp. So I'm taking the clean signal as it comes through. I'm sending that signal out to the phaser. I'm then processing the signal through the amp, and then I'm returning the phased effect, which will then blend before it goes to the cabinet. So this allows me to send from anywhere in the path and then return to a different place in the path. So if I now look at this, again, the send still has a volume and how much of the dry signal you want to send through to the amp. In this case, I'm sending it neutrally. And then the return's got similar. The only thing it doesn't have is the trails. But again, I've got the mix and the return set up. So let's hear how that sounds. Now, if I increase that, drop that to 30%, as I did the other one, you hear there's more of that clean sound coming through. And if I make it up to 100%, really, really wet sound there. So the send and return allows me to send out to a device, and I may not want to send it back. So an example of this could be that I want to put the send after the amp, but before the cabinet. And so that I'm sending that to my physical amp, and I'm not getting that cabinet IR problem because I've got a cabinet attached to my amp. Now, this would still then go through to the front of house, so the audience will still hear the full baked outcome, but my stage amp will only get the clean signal. In case it could be here, I might want to completely bypass that, and instead of sending to the phaser, I'm just going to send to the return on my amp, or even the input on my amp. Returns can also be used as a secondary input. So you might decide that you want to have a second bass connected in. With my attitude basses on my LT, because the LT doesn't have a left in and a right in, I use the guitar input, and I also then use a return for the second pickup. So stereo bass, I need two inputs. One's the guitar and the other one is the return. And I treat the return as if it was another guitar input. So again, an alternative to that is you might have another external sound source that you want to mix into this. It might be a drone sound, or it might be a keyboard or something else that you want to come in at a certain part of your signal path to pick up where your bass is and play along with that. In the video I've done on using your HX Stomp as an in-ear monitoring system, that's how we configure the return. We set it, instead of being instrument setup, we set that up as an auxiliary in. By having it as an auxiliary in, it allows us to have that as an external sound source that I can play along to, but it doesn't fit as part of my signal chain. So in the case of the effects loop, the other thing that I've done is I have assigned foot switch 1 to turn that block off or on, to allow me to go in, have the phaser come on or come off. You can do that with the phaser's own foot switch, but I prefer to control it through the HX. In the send and receive, in the send and return one, I'm doing the same thing, same foot switch, but in this case, I've got that foot switch to control the send block and the return block. So both of those will go on and off together. The HX Stomp becomes a Swiss Army knife of everything. Not only can I keep my sounds in the box and have it do everything, but if I want to use that extra pedal in the effects loop, I can. My recommendation is that stereo cable. So it's stereo, stereo to left and right. That allows you to, if you want to run 2 effects loops, you can do that. Or you can still just use it as I've done in this video with a single effects loop there. And remember, you can daisy chain your effects. So you might put a chorus and a phaser and a delay connected to each other off the single effects loop. Or you might decide that you want to be able to control the phaser and a delay independently with 2 different foot switches, and therefore you're going to want to run the 2 different loops. Anyway, let me know how you're using it, and catch you next time.